Hey guys, welcome to lesson 722 day 1. Nothing super new today, it's just that we're going to really focus on the components of these trig graphs and practice identifying the various pieces of them just based on looking at the graph itself. So first I want to draw your attention to these general formats. Notice how they look absolutely identical, aside from the fact that this one is cosine, this one is sine, right? So they work exactly the same way. A is for the vertical stretch or compression. We don't really do compressions in this class for these graphs, we just kind of do stretches. And it also is the amplitude. H is the phase shift. We don't worry about those in this class for sure, but we do worry about K, which is also representative of the midline, responsible for the vertical movement of your graph. Also, side note, if there is a negative sign in front of the A, then there is a reflection. So, for this first problem, you want to start by figuring out whether it's a sine graph or a cosine graph. So, remember that sine graphs look like this, or if it's flipped, it'll look like this, right? Whereas a cosine graph would look like this, or if it's flipped, it would look like this. So when you're looking at this and you're trying to figure out which one it is, hopefully you would understand that it looks a lot more like the cosine. This is the regular, this is flipped. This is regular, this is flipped. Alright, so we are just going to go ahead and circle this cosine there. And then the next thing is whether it's been reflected. Now hopefully you'd see that this looks like a ditch in the ground, not a mountain, so it's positive, meaning it has not been reflected. Okay, this is the flipped version of a cosine graph. All right, the midline. Now, the midline is the horizontal line between the highest and lowest points. So if you know that your highest point is at 3 and your lowest point is at -1, you've got to find the perfect middle number between those two. And that happens to be 1 in this case, right? The midline is going to be right here. So I'll take my line here and put it there. Oops, that's not it. Alright, so there's my midline, and what I'll write is y equals 1. Right, and then the amplitude depends on where the midline is too. It's the distance between the midline and the highest or lowest points. Both are the same. So if I were to take a look at this distance right here, it is a distance of 1 to 0 and 0 to 1, so that's 2. I could also do it from highest to midline, which you would get the same thing, right? That between 1 and 3 is a space of 2. So either one is fine to find the amplitude. Alright, the period is determined by figuring out how long it takes on the x-axis to complete one full cycle. So you know when you end up back to the height that you started, that you have completed a cycle. So here we start up here at 3, we go down, 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 then back up, 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 and when we land back at 3, that's when I know that my cycle has ended. And to find the period, then you trace that down to the x-axis and see what value you lie on. So in our case, it's 2 pi. Now that is the default period, so here clearly there hasn't been like horizontal shrinkage or anything, but sometimes there will be, and you'll see examples of that on my Open Math. Alright, so we're ready to write the equation now. And we've got to follow this general format. I'm hoping by now you have most of this memorized, and that's kind of how I'm going to operate here. If not, refer back to it. So you start with y equals. Your amplitude goes first. If you have a reflection, then you would put a negative sign first, but we don't. So we're going to go straight to the amplitude, or the A. So 2, then comes cosine. We know it's a cosine. We don't have an h, so it's just x. And then the midline comes at the very, very end. We know ours is at +1, so we'll do +1. And that is it. I am all done with my equation. Alright, on to the next one. Here we have another cosine graph. Hopefully you'd recognize by these pictures. This one actually happens to be a reflected cosine graph because it's following this mountain type look here. So we can definitely start with this part. Oops. Yes. So this tells you right away that we're going to need a negative sign in our equation. Next comes the midline. So the highest point is at 1, the lowest point is at -1. So the very middle between those two is right here at 0. So let's go ahead and place our midline right over there. And we'll write our equation for the midline, which is y equals 0. Just use whatever number that is. The amplitude then is that distance between the midline and the highest or lowest point. This is, I prefer to do it from the peak. So here we have a distance from 0 to 1. So that has a space of 1, so my amplitude is 1. The period, as before, you start at the beginning and you trace, and once your graph ends up at the same height at which it started, I started at -1 and now here I've ended at -1, trace it back to your x-axis and that is your period. So it's going to be 2 pi here as well. So now let's go ahead and do our equation. Kind of can follow this format. So we have y equals, it's very important that you remember this negative sign needs to be there in the beginning. Then comes our a value, our amplitude. So we will say, our amplitude is 1, just kidding. Then comes cosine. And then comes our midline. Now, a couple things to remember here. If your amplitude is 1, you don't have to write the number, it's optional. Similarly, if your midline is at 0, it's also optional to write, but I'm just going to go ahead and write it just so you can see where it would go. Alright, so really, you could just, another way to write this would be y equals negative cosine x. This is just as valid, just because these pieces are optional, just because multiplying by 1 doesn't do anything, and adding 0 also doesn't really do anything. Alright, on to the next. Now I've given you the equation along with the graph. First, let me go ahead and fix this mistake. We fixed it in class too. Whoops, this should be a 2. But anyway, let's start by identifying the midline. We already know it's a sine curve because we have the equation in front of us. The midline will be right in between our highest and lowest as usual. So our highest is at 3, and our lowest point seems to be all the way down at -1 here. So you find the middle, and we would figure that it's right here at 1. That is the middle. Oops. So let's go ahead and take our midline and draw it. It's a little big. Alright, so we can write that our midline is at y equals 1. Now, the thing is, you can figure this out from the graph by looking at it, or if you're remembering how to work with the equation, you know that this is k, which is also the midline. So you can figure it out from the equation or the graph. Similarly, you can also find the amplitude from the equation or the graph. On the graph, you find the distance between the highest or lowest and the midline. So you can count this distance, which is between 1 and 3, there's a space of 2. The other way you could figure it out is by looking at this equation and noticing that this a value right here is the amplitude. Alright, and then my period, this is slightly different than the last two we did. We start at the beginning. We can go ahead and trace our graph. It's going to be a little ugly. And you keep going until you end up at the same height you started. So if I started at 1 here, I got to go until I come back to 1. Obviously, don't stop here though. You guys know better. So here I stop back at the midline. And I know it's a sine curve, so you also should have an idea of what the curve's going to look like. And once you found the end of it, trail it down to the x-axis, and I find that my period is 2 pi over 3. Alright, one last one here. Don't have the equation this time, but that's alright. So is it sine or cosine? Hopefully you recognize this nice S-curve, so that's going to be a sine. And remember, sine when it's this way is regular, sine when it's this way is flipped. So this one, since it goes up first, it's going to be our regular, so there is no reflection. Midline will be between the highest and lowest, so between 2, which is the highest, and -2 is the lowest. So in the middle would be 0 here. Let's put a nice midline there. All right, and that is a y equals 0. Our amplitude, distance between midline and peak, this goes from 0 to 2, so it's a distance of 2. Amplitude is 2. Now the period, as you trace this, you start in the beginning, you trace back at the midline here at the end of our curve. Our period is 2 pi. All right, so let's go to make our equation. We have y equals, there's no reflection, so we don't need a negative sign, but we do have an amplitude, which goes next. And then cosine. Oh, sorry, it's not cosine, it's sine. Gosh, this bugs me. All right, sine of x. And then our midline goes at the end. Now again, if it's a midline of 0, you don't have to draw it or write it in there, but we can, and I just will to make sure that you guys know where it goes. All right, and then, you know, there's one other problem on My Open Math that I would like to do with you, just so that, you know, in case you're still a little confused about identifying the period, the ones on My Open Math are pretty good practice. They're a little more challenging. So I thought, let me just throw it in my video. I have about 3 minutes left. All right, so let's do number 2 and 3. Maybe we'd have time to do those. All right, so here we have, all right, I paused recording and decided to move the picture to Smart Notebook because I remembered that I can't write on my internet browser. So on this, you would follow the same process of, you know, finding the period, just like we talked about on the notes. You would start at whatever point is on the y-axis here. So in our case, it's going to be right here. And then you want to go ahead and start tracing. So we're tracing, and then at this point, you should start to see, like, form an opinion about which one it would be, right? Like sine or cosine. This, if it's going down and then up and then it's still not done, like, this is going to be a sine graph. So then, that's an indicator that you want to stop back at your midline. Okay, so once I make it back to -2, I know that this is one cycle. So this, I would trail back to my x-axis, okay, and recognize that this is my period. So my period is going to be pi over 3. Okay, and then from there you can find the midline and the amplitude. Those are pretty straightforward from there. All right, so let's do one more example on there. This was number 2 on the Open Math. This is going to be number 3, I think. So same idea. You start at the y-axis, start tracing, keep going, keep going. This is looking like a sine graph. Oh, that got ugly. I don't care. Oh, well. And I will end right back at the same height where I started. And then we'll trail it down, and we'll recognize that my period is 5 because my cycle ended after it went from 0 to 5. All right. So hopefully that's helpful for you guys. So give those Open Math problems a try, and let me know if you need help.